thank you very much for coming along to EcoViews and News. Today we want to look at this problem of the infiltration, in a sense, of our electoral system by a whole lot of cash. What's come up very recently, but been very active and quite effective in changing the nature of the national debate. We're in trouble here in a way because we're basically looking at a circumstance in which we think we have an election coming up, but that election, in fact, is being precluded by the number of voices that are being brought to bear, and in fact, the whole effort to silence certain kinds of voices and privilege others. That is, bring to the fore a certain range of voices that, in effect, can pay for access to the airways. And in paying for access to the airways, they can basically eliminate the candidates they don't want and favor the candidates they do want. So in effect, they're purchasing the election. This is not petty cash or small change. This is tens of millions of dollars being spent largely in an unattributed manner. And the trouble with it is that a lot of it's coming from big oil, and it's coupling itself, multiplying its impact in a sense, with bad science and ending up with a global tragedy. This is far from being a party political issue. This isn't a good guys versus bad guys in the in the usual American political scene of them versus us. This has to do with the way science is being misused and multiplied out of all proportion with large money to end up with a global tragedy. As one observer has pointed out, and we'll see a little later, this is not a trivial issue. This is way beyond party politics. Now, you recall that last time we touched upon what was the origin of this, and it had a lot to do with the fact that back in January 22nd, the Supreme Court made a decision. Actually, it was on the 21st they made the decision, the Thursday, but on Friday it was reported in the New York Times, and the justices decided, in a sense, 5-4, to reject any limitation on corporation spending in the campaign. That's been the source of the problem. At the time, the lobbyists said, in effect, they have new power. Cross us and our cash will bury you. This was the promise at the time. And as it was quoted in the Times in Kirkpatrick's story, we've got $1 million we can spend advertising for you or against you, whichever you want. A lobbyist can tell lawmakers, okay, we can spend it for you or against you. That's the equation. And of course, that was what, in effect, galvanized the American political system, spending millions of dollars for the candidate or against the candidate, in effect choosing candidates. And you'll see the president just recently, as I think I pointed out to you, underscored the way in which this can corrupt the American political system. Let's take a listen again, just briefly, to his outline of this.
Back in January, in my State of the Union address, I warned of the danger posed by a Supreme Court ruling called Citizens United. This decision overturned decades of law and precedent. It gave the special interests the power to spend without limit and without public disclosure to run ads in order to influence elections. Now, as an election approaches, it's not just a theory. We can see for ourselves how destructive to our democracy this can become. We've seen it in the flood of deceptive attack ads sponsored by special interests using front groups with misleading names. We don't know who's behind these ads or who's paying for them. Even foreign-controlled corporations seeking to influence our democracy are able to spend freely in order to swing an election toward a candidate they prefer.
Now, that's actually a very interesting proposition. Which foreign countries might want to swing an election toward a candidate that they prefer? Well, you might ask yourself, in reference to global environmental issues, especially restrictions on the use of carbon, those countries interested in selling carbon and in promoting the sale of oil might have a very direct interest in influencing American elections. And this extends not to the classic, just to the classic Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia, which have an interest in exporting oil, but to, at this point, the former Soviet Union, currently Russia. And in fact, if you look on the web at the website that regularly carries anti-climate restriction rules, it's Russia Today. Look at the Russia Today site and see how they're lining up on the issue of climate change.
We've tried to fix this with a new law, one that would simply require that you say who you are and who's paying for your ad.
Well, that seems simple enough. A new law requiring disclosure. Who is actually paying for these ads? Is it the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, that is Russia Today, or is it the oil companies themselves, or is it the oil exporting countries that are paying for new front groups, as you call them? Now, this is actually a very important thing to keep in mind, because as it turns out, this last week we learned a lot about what's being referred to as the shadow campaign. Take a look. Shadow campaign is really quite extraordinary. It's been documented now on a national radio program, TV program, and you can call it up and view it at your own will at this point. This is the documentation that was put forward by PBS.
Colorado is one of the key states in the Republicans' attempt to take control of both the House and the Senate on November 2nd. GOP strategists think the party can knock off Democratic Senator Michael Bennet and two of the state's Democratic House members.
Michael Bennett's votes are so bad he can't defend them. So he's attacking me with false and unfair.
That means Coloradans are being bombarded with political
I believe in
ads.
2010, Ken Buck wants to limit women's access to birth control.
Ken Buck also wants to make a comment.
They tend to be negative ads.
Who is he to make that choice?
What's happened to Michael Bennett?
The majority rip into Democratic incumbents without even mentioning their Republican challengers.
How does any of that help Colorado?
But a lot of those ads aren't being run by the candidates.
Club for Growth Action is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Instead, they're coming from groups with generic names with a whiff of populism about them. American Crossroads, Americans for Job Security, Americans for Prosperity.
Now, this is familiar. New groups that seem to have emerged from nowhere with a whiff of populism about them. American Crossroads, this, that, and the other thing. This should be familiar to us by now because of the campaigns that we've seen oil companies, API, in particular the American Petroleum Institute, supporting these AstroTurf campaigns, these supposedly grassroots effort where they bus in people and demonstrate and then the grassroots goes away on the bus. These AstroTurf campaigns are well organized, well orchestrated, and well funded. Well, this is the kind of thing now that's emerging in these sort of American Crossroads ads and things like this. Take a look at it because it's really an extraordinary move in American history.
These groups and others like them are spending tens of millions of dollars to swing.
Tens of millions of dollars to swing what?
The election from coast to coast.
Missourians want to make their own.
And delivering remarkably consistent
but
messages.
But Titus ignored us. Opposed to healthcare takeover, but Earl Pomeroy ignored us.
The deficit tripled. Our unemployment near highest 20% Republicans.
Donnelly voted for Pelosi's budget, which would increase the national debt by $1 trillion.
Is enough.
This is the new wave of bare-knuckle campaigners, a wave that the Supreme Court unleashed in January when it decided the Citizens United case.
Okay, the new wave of bare-knuckle campaigners is the way they put it. When the Supreme Court unleashed these new participants in the American scene because of their January decision. Take a look at the way they portray it again.
The decision gutted almost 40 years of campaign finance rules. Those old rules work like this. Candidates have to disclose who is paying the bills. There are limits on how much individuals can give to campaigns or political parties. And there's a federal agency, the Federal Election Commission, that enforces the rules. But now, all three of those rules are withering away.
Now, that's pretty extraordinary. The decision threw over 40 years of precedent and the three basic rules. Who funds the campaign rule, that is the disclosure rule, the limits, now there are no limits, and the oversight by the Federal Election Commission. All three of those things are thrown out. Now that's an extraordinary transformation of the American electoral scene in less than a year. This happened in January according to the Supreme Court's decision, and this is the first election that will reflect those new rules.
For president, I for president, I for president, I for president.
Under the old rules, if you wanted to run a campaign ad, you had to be a candidate or a political party.
What have the Democrats ever done for you?
You couldn't take donations from corporations or unions, and you had to disclose who was giving you money. But the Citizens United decision tossed out those restrictions. It gave corporations, trade associations, and unions the right to get involved and to spend as much as they want on political ads. That's because spending money, according to the court, is the same as speaking your mind. It's protected by the First Amendment.
California seniors are worried.
They can do it anonymously, too, as long as they put their money into so-called independent political groups. So, instead of giving money directly to a candidate or political party, corporations, trade associations, and unions can pass donations through organizations that don't have to disclose their supporters' names. They can spend the cash on TV and radio ads, direct mail campaigns, automated phone calls, and so on. Campaign watchdogs call these groups corporate fronts.
Okay, corporate fronts. What are we up against here then in this election? Well, an unprecedented capacity for corporate fronts to intervene. That's why it's being called the shadow campaign, and deserves our attention here, because it's not just what the candidates think, but what they're being funded to think. And they're not being funded directly. They're not being bought directly. It's what messages are they saying that are being funded by other independent front groups. Well, what kind of corporate fronts are active in the election? It's worth asking. Who is really behind these corporate fronts? And what do these corporate fronts have to do with environmental issues? Our concern here in Eco Views and News. Well, we've heard recently about David H. Koch and his influence, especially in New York, but also beyond, and in California. There's been a investigative report done in the New Yorker on this, and it was the subject of some discussion on Democracy Now! Recently. You may have seen the broadcast initially, but it's worth trying to bring it up in order to see what's at stake here. This is quite an extraordinary development, and we'll see if we can see the interview here that Amy conducted.
Talk about another piece now, Chuck. Chuck Lewis, you're quoted in this major article in the latest issue of the New Yorker magazine by Jane Mayer that profiles billionaire brothers Charles and David Koch, who have quietly given more than $100 million to right-wing causes.
Now, $100 million is more than spare change, right? They're not giving them directly to these candidates. They're giving them to the causes, these new front groups. Now, extraordinary impact here, hundreds of millions of dollars, more than 100 in the case of these two billionaires.
Jane Mayer writes, quote, "In Washington, David Koch is best known as part of a family that's repeatedly funded stealth attacks on the federal government and the Obama administration in particular. With his brother Charles, who's 74, David Koch owns virtually all of Koch Industries, a conglomerate headquartered in Wichita, Kansas, whose annual revenues are estimated to be $100 billion. The Kochs operate oil refineries in Alaska, Texas, and Minnesota and control some 4,000 miles of pipeline. Koch Industries owns owns Brawny paper towels, Dixie cups, Georgia Pacific lumber, Stainmaster carpet, and Lycra, among other products. Forbes ranks it as the second largest private company in the country after Cargill, and its consistent profitability has made David and Charles Koch, who years ago bought out two other brothers, among the richest men in America. Their combined fortune of $35 billion is exceeded only by those of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. The New Yorker piece goes on to say the Kochs are longtime libertarians who believe in drastically lower personal and corporate taxes, minimal social services for the needy, and much less oversight of industry, especially environmental regulation.
Well, that's why we might be interested in it. We're getting hundreds of millions of dollars being spent by billionaires in front corporations because they're interested in less oversight on industry in relation to environmental regulation. Well, let's see what else is said about them.
Mayor goes on to write, quote, "Indeed, the brothers have funded opposition campaigns against so many Obama administration policies, from health care reform to the economic stimulus program, that in political circles, their ideological network is known as the Kochtopus." Koch Industries has a response to the New Yorker article on its website. It reads, quote, "We submitted extensive facts and background information to the magazine. Given that all we provided did not change the publication's negative, unbalanced tone and agenda, we declined their request to speak to Koch executives. The story dredges up issues resolved long ago and mischaracterizes our business philosophy and principles, our practices and performance record, and the education efforts and policies we support." It then goes on to address specific points like their environmental record, climate change, the group's Americans for Prosperity and Citizens for a Sound Economy, healthcare reform, and so on. Well, Chuck Lewis, talk about the significance of these oil billionaires, the Koch brothers, and what their money, at more than $100 million funneled into right-wing causes, including climate change denying groups, has meant.
Well, yeah, I've been following the Koch brothers now unofficially, I guess you'd say. I mean, when I ran the Center for Public Integrity for 15 years, I first brushed up against them because they were one of Bob Dole's top 10 career patrons. And then I wanted to see
Koch, by the way, is spelled K-O-C-H
yeah.
for people who've seen it but didn't know how it was pronounced.
Right, not the soft drink, yeah. Anyway, I started noticing this company some years ago. It is true. They have, I think the 100 million number may be a very conservative number by the New Yorker and by Jane Mayer. And by the way, the Koch Industries company and the Koch brothers essentially planted a very fawning profile of the Koch brothers in the New York magazine days before as a way of preempting the New Yorker article. And they never consent to interviews. I tried to interview them for 2 different Buying of the President books, and they had no interest whatsoever in talking, and in one case they mildly threatened to sue. So they are these are very aggressive brothers, and of course among the wealthiest people on planet Earth. What makes them different? We have seen rich people try to influence politics in America since the beginning of the Republic. What makes them unusual, and I've been around Washington since roughly around Watergate in the mid-'70s, what makes the Koch brothers unusual is the amount of money that they have spent, and done it in a stealthy, undisclosed manner. But folks have found out over the years how much the money is, over 100 million, and it's probably much larger. That is almost entirely spent to further the interest of Koch Industries.
Okay, well, I'd urge you to view the entire interview. It's an extraordinary document about the influence of these billionaires who have set up these front corporations to, in effect, front organizations to funnel money to the political campaigns. Now, this isn't without some objection on the part of political figures. In fact, you can look at it quite dramatically these days on the West Coast, where the Koch brothers are.
The outpouring of money leading to last night's extraordinary outpouring from the Republican governor of California, talking about a political campaign now underway there to, in essence, take over the state with cash in order to undo the legislation he signed 4 years ago to reduce carbon emissions there by 30% by the year 2020. The ads claiming his new law will kill jobs.
Does anyone really believe that these companies, out of the goodness of their black oil hearts, are spending millions and millions of dollars to protect jobs?
Well, this is an interesting way of putting it. Arnold Schwarzenegger doesn't seem to think that they're working on a selfless basis here, and is quite angry at the way they're, in effect, spending money in California to overturn a law that he's put in place.
In the rest of his speech, audio of which was provided to Countdown, Governor Schwarzenegger did not hesitate to name which companies, including the Koch brothers, founders of the Tea Party movement. Here's how he started.
I want to talk about the corruption of the democratic process and about forces willing to sabotage this country's economic future for private gain. I want to talk about Texas oil interests that have descended upon California to overturn a California environmental law. And then, as soon as they've done their dirty work, thanks to millions of dollars of scare tactic advertising, they intend, in the words of their own spokesperson, to fold up their tents and go home. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a great drama. There's a great struggle playing out here in California right now that the rest of the world doesn't pay much attention to and knows very little about. And that's why I'm here today to put the spotlight on this very important issue. And let me just say that the entire oil industry is not involved in this deception that I will explain here today. No, there are some oil companies that are trying to do the right thing, but others are not. Oil companies like Valero and Tesoro and Frontier and Koch Industries are blatantly trying to manipulate the will of the people and the public good.
Okay, well, you can see that he was quite irritated at this whole intervention of the Koch brothers in his state, and he says they're not interested in creating jobs as they say they are, and no one would believe that in California. Does anyone really believe that these companies, out of the goodness of their black oil hearts, are spending millions of dollars to create jobs? Well, however they're spending it, they're having an impact. Take a look. I mean, this is pretty...
This is Planet 100. Welcome to Planet 100, the top environmental news stories of the day in 100 seconds or less. I'm Sarah Backhouse, and it's Tuesday, September 21st. It appears America is at a climate tipping point as a host of Republican Senate hopefuls trumpet their rejection of climate science on the campaign trail. Christine O'Donnell knocked off pro-climate Republican Mike Castle in Delaware's open-seat GOP Senate primary. She joins Nevada's Sharon Angle, who dismisses man-made global warming as a mantra of the left, and Wisconsin's Ron Johnson, who blames warming on sunspots, and a host of other Tea Party-backed Republican Senate candidates who reject the science connecting humans to greenhouse gas emissions. The tragic result? More clean energy jobs lost to China.
Well, lost to China, that may be one of the tragic results, but as the Times pointed out, the Kochs are having enormously bad influence on the entire country because of disastrously wrong science that they're using and disastrously wrong economics, as they pointed out. Who wins in this prospect? Well, perhaps the Koch brothers. And the losers? The people of California, surely. But the biggest loser will be planet Earth. This is what they emphasize. The biggest loser will be the planet. Well, this is what big oil times bad science is leading us to. And the fellow who pointed it out very strongly the other day was Noam Chomsky.
The country is going to be substantially taken over by people who completely reject an overwhelming scientific consensus, and it's not a trivial issue unless something significant is done about the looming environmental catastrophe. It's going to be a total disaster.
Now, that's a pretty extraordinary statement. Unless something is done about the looming environmental catastrophe, this is going to be a total disaster. As he points out, This is not a trivial issue. Well, join us next week at the same time, either on air or online, and we'll keep the conversation going.